Well, Dr. Stan back here at the Genesis Communication Network, coming to you from the hills overlooking beautiful and picturesque Monterey Bay, and bringing you the news behind the news, the story behind the story. Hoping to convince you that reality is usually scoffed at, that illusion is usually king. But in the battle for survival of Western civilization, it's going to be reality and not illusion or delusion that will determine what the future will bring. And I need to remind you the views expressed here are not necessarily those of the owners, management, staff, sponsors, or supporters of the station you're listening to. They happen to be my views. And, well, for the next hour, they're going to be the views of our good friend Joel Skousen from World Affairs Brief, who's going to bring us up to date on what's really going on behind the scenes, because, ladies and gentlemen, they put out a lot of stories to confuse us. They put out a lot of disinformation. How do we manage to interpret what's going on? Well, that's why we look forward every week to hearing from Joel Skousen. Joel, what's going on this week?
Well, every week now it seems like the crescendo of voices calling for an imminent collapse of the world economy grow and grow, and so I'm dedicating the major article tomorrow in the World Affairs Brief to signs of the economic collapse, if, when, and how bad. So I think it'll make for an interesting discussion. When major insider banks like Goldman Sachs start shorting the markets in a big way and advise their high roller clients by a private letter to do the same, you can bet the markets are going to take a beating in October. Now, whether or not this ends up being an actual collapse of the world economy or merely another one of the periodic times in which fundamentals take hold and markets collapse and then rebound again, that's what we need to discuss. The puts, that is shorting the S&P 500, are at a record high for October, which indicates that a lot of big money is predicting a huge fall in global stocks very soon. Certainly the fundamentals concur that stocks are overpriced and that the interest rates are artificially low compared to real inflation. But are we on the cusp of a major depression? Well, let's see. The deepest and least solvable crisis is, of course, the collapsing dominoes of sovereign debt. Every nation on earth, except for a few whose abundant oil income exceeds expenditures, like Norway and Saudi Arabia, is heavily overextended, and none can or will pay back the huge sovereign debt that they have accumulated. At least a half a dozen countries stand and require quarterly bailouts from other nations in order to pay back debt issues that have come due. The Ukraine is the latest nation to join that list after Belarus. They have stopped paying public employees so that they can pay their debt payment that's coming due. And as I say, part of the reason is because investors who bought sovereign debt suddenly want their money back. They aren't willing to roll that over, which is normally happens in normal circumstances. People just say, well, yeah, give me another bond issue for another 6 months, but everybody seems to be collecting their money now, which is only wise. According to the Wall Street Journal, who got a copy of Goldman's pessimistic letter to its biggest clients, it said in a 54-page report, now that's a big report, Stan, sent to hundreds of Goldman's international clients, dated August 16th, a Goldman strategist who sits on the firm's trading desk argued that as much as $1 trillion in capital may be needed to shore up European banks, that small businesses in the U.S., which has been a past driver of job production, are still languishing, and that China growth may not be sustainable. Well, Michael Snyder reacts to that by saying, Goldman Sachs is at it again. Goldman is telling the public that everything is fine and recovery is just around the corner. Meanwhile, they're advising their top clients to bet on a huge financial collapse. Now, using the word collapse is not Goldman Sachs' words, but Snyder's. It's a bit of an exaggeration. Goldman's preparing for a major financial crisis, not predicting a collapse. Perhaps most startling of it all is what the report has to say about the debt problems of the United States and Europe. Quote, solving a debt problem with more debt has not solved the underlying problem. In the U.S., Treasury debt growth financed the U.S. consumer, but has not had enough of an impact on job growth. Can the U.S. continue to depreciate the dollar, the world's base currency, it asks? Well, it sounds like Goldman is listening to Ron Paul while at the same time repudiating him politically, as all the establishment is. But apparently everybody believes him because in their private letters they're saying just what Ron Paul is saying. The report also goes into great detail about the financial crisis in Europe. It says that Europe is headed for trouble and how a dozen financial institutions in Europe could potentially be in danger of failure, a threat which the powers that be intend to use, in my opinion, to pressure EU voters to give more power to the European Central Bank to issue euro-wide bonds. Well, the following is how Business Insider summarizes the advice that Goldman Sachs gave in their report about how to make money off the impending collapse. 1, buy 6 months put options on the euro versus the Swiss franc, thus betting that the euro will drop against the franc. Well, that's not hard to do. Franc is also a currency that official Goldman reports say is the most overvalued in the world. And it really is, because there isn't a lot to back up the Swiss franc. It's just that it isn't inflating as bad as the euro. That's going to change, though, now that the franc, under political pressure, has agreed to peg itself to the euro, meaning as the euro goes down, the franc will go down. The other advice was to buy a 5-year derivative, a credit default swap on the index of European corporate debt. In other words, they're saying, everybody, hey, bet on, if it goes down, that you'll get paid an insurance payout, because it's surely going to go down. Well, this is a bet that some of these companies will default, of course, in your insurance policy. The CDS will pay off, even though these CDS policies are backed by nothing except promises to pay by the companies issuing them. So if they go bankrupt, as AIG did, then there's no guarantee you'll get paid on those credit default swaps. And this is so typical of Goldman Sachs, Stan. They'll say anything publicly and then turn around and do the total opposite privately.
I think you're exactly right. I'm always suspicious of what they said. And you remember, of course, when they were selling the collateralized debt obligations, these mortgages, they were telling everybody what a great thing that they were. At the same time, they were actually betting against them. So these people give hypocrisy a bad name. I don't know what to believe about what they said. You remember, it was a month ago they were saying gold was going to go up to $2,000 or $2,500 an ounce, and then the next thing it drops, and I'm not surprised it dropped at all. But I think that many times Goldman puts out information just so that they can certainly fleece their customers.
Yeah, they've got to be careful, though, not to what they say privately to their top rollers. This, combined with the other revelations that the number of put options is 10 times normal for October, indicates that somebody's betting on the market going down. So I'm issuing this warning in the report that there is going to be a major downturn in the markets in October. I am not, however, concluding, as so many commentators on our side of the spectrum are, saying that there's a tremendous amount of fear of global financial and the collapse of the dollar is imminent. I'm not saying that, and I don't think it's going to happen. Most of these big banks will not admit how bad things are publicly, but privately there's a whole lot of fretting going on, especially it's more of a fret of whether or not the Fed is going to keep bailing them out. These banks now, both internationally and the too big to fail banks in the United States, are totally dependent on cheap money from the Fed to keep them going, because they're certainly not investing in anything in the real economy. Also, a lot of hedge fund managers are set to lose their jobs. Some of the largest hedge funds are down 25% for the year, Stan. And according to the Wall Street Journal, Friday marks a deadline for investors in many hedge funds with monthly and quarterly liquidity to say whether they want their capital back or whether or not they're going to turn them over. Most that have been polled by the Wall Street Journal said that they want their cash out and are not planning to roll over into another hedge fund. So we could see them taking a bath. Now, that's the same reason that Greek needs quarterly bailouts, mostly because investors don't want to renew their investments in Greek bonds at any interest rate. Right now they're getting 30. Excuse me. They're getting 30% to stay in Greek bonds, but if you're going to lose everything, if they're going to default, then why keep doing that?
I agree with you. I think we're in very difficult times. I think the one thing about the hedge funds is people don't realize that they're heavily leveraged, and basically when they lose $1, many times they're losing actually $25 or $30. So this is one reason for hedge fund investors to be skeptical and worried, because of course many of them thought the price of gold was going to go.
Radio Network.
Well, Dr. Stan back here at the Genesis Communication Network, coming to you from the hills overlooking beautiful and picturesque Monterey Bay, and bringing you the news behind the news, the story behind the story. And our guest this afternoon is Joel Skousen, and he's talking about this whole idea that there's going to be a mammoth collapse in October, and Joel thinks that the market's going to go down, but this is not going to be the end of the world. Certainly the whole economy is not going to fall apart in October, although there probably will be a significant financial contraction because so many of the big boys seem to be betting that the market is going to fall, and they have puts on the market. So go right ahead, Joel.
That's right, and of course, the Greek situation is really driving a lot of this, and the European Central Bank, in order to avoid establishing a precedent of default, because default is always looming. The European Central Bank was having to bail out Greece every single quarter because as their bonds mature and people want out of them rather than roll over the bonds, they're having to inject cash into Greece in order to keep them from defaulting. Once a pattern of default happens, could be a panic all over Europe for Spanish bonds, for Portuguese bonds, for Irish bonds. All of these are extremely weak and near bankruptcy. However, ultimately, they want to engineer and get away from the short-term bailouts by engineering a rule change in the EU that would allow the entire Union to create bonds guaranteed by all countries in the European Union, putting it on par with the Fed being able to issue it on behalf of all people and states in the Union. However, that plan suffered a major setback this week as the German Constitutional Court ruled that, quote, no further fiscal powers may be surrendered to Europe without a new constitution and a popular referendum. Now that's really something. The head of Germany's Constitutional Court, Andreas Voskuhl, said politicians do not have the legal authority to sign away the birthright of the German people without their explicit consent. The sovereignty of the German state is inviolate and anchored in perpetuity by basic law, meaning constitution. It may not be abandoned by the legislature. There is little leeway left for giving up core powers to the EU. If one wants to go beyond this limit, which might be politically legitimate and desirable, giving a hint that he's a globalist, he doesn't oppose them, then Germany must give itself a new constitution, and a referendum on that would be necessary. Now, this means the EU's rescue machinery of 2 trillion euros is not going to have Germany's backing no matter how badly Chancellor Angela Merkel wants it. But all this didn't stop the globalists in Europe from wringing as much money from this limited power they still have to bail out other nations. They are going to take that to the maximum. Today, the German lower house, the Bundestag, passed a bill to strengthen the bailout fund intended to help European countries deal with their debts. Stocks, of course, looking for any justification in America for optimism, surged upwards. But if the market, as Market Oracle of the UK said, if the European Financial Stability Fund, that's the EFSF, they have acronyms for everything today, this gives carte blanche powers to carry out measures to save the euro, the insolvent countries and banks, the passage of this legislation by Germany, which has already been passed by the Bundesrat, which is the Senate, would leave Germany with no more say on the use of increased funding just to save the euro, Greece, and 5 other nations. This is an impossible task, he says, will cost from $4 to $6 trillion. All control passes to the ECB, the European Central Bank, another loss of sovereignty for Germans. Most money for this fund solves the current liquidity crisis, but won't fix the solvency crisis. As usual, more debt doesn't solve anything when you've got a debt crisis. Now, this voting by the Germans will settle the markets for a few weeks, but all of the European globalists realize that semi-solvent nations in Europe are in no mood to go the next step of giving the ECB powers to issue EU-wide bonds for which they will be liable. This may well be the reason we're seeing the market set up for short selling in October, Stan. Somebody obviously has given the word that a major market sell-off is going to happen. If it goes deep enough, may well be the crisis sufficient to drive European voters into accepting more EU powers to fix the problem. So this is what I'm proposing, is that this crisis, which is obviously known to the insider that's coming up in October, is meant to drive the change in the European Union towards a new EU treaty and more powers to, because, I mean, it will scare everyone in the markets if there's a major sell-off in European and U.S. stocks in October. Notice that the U.S. leaders, both Obama and Treasury Secretary Geithner, are criticizing Europe for not taking, quote, dramatic steps or for moving too slowly. In reality, they know that Europe doesn't have the same dramatic powers of the Fed, so the criticism is offensive to European leaders. Its real purpose, of course, is to prepare the way for a U.S.-style solution that is more bailout through bonding when the crisis hits. So what does this mean for those of us in the U.S.? It means a big drop in the stock market in October probably, but does not mean that the economy will collapse. I think it will be a serious dip, but not a permanent one. Obama's been sending out proposal after proposal to increase government stimulus in jobs and in housing. Even go-along Republican leaders like John Boehner can't go along with this because all conservative eyes are on the debt problem we face. However, I can see a massive shakeout in the stock market, the crisis, suddenly turning around public opinion and inducing them to believe government fear-mongering that we've got to inject more money into the economy lest it collapse. I mean, it'd just be like the TARP thing all over again, Stan. Why the whole banking system is going to collapse if we don't inject some money into it. Why else would Ben Bernanke and Tim Geithner suddenly stop talking positivism this week and concentrate on dire warnings about unemployment and other things? I think they're setting us up for this coming crisis, not because they don't have the power to inject more money and forestall it, but because they need something to stop the rising sentiment against the Fed and against deficit spending.
Could very well be.
Now, let's say they let this crisis go long enough. It will doom Obama's chances of re-election. Nobody gets re-elected in the middle of a crisis. But if it is sufficiently sharp, and Congress relents early on and agrees to hand out more stimulus jobs and checks, then Obama will look like he saved us from collapse. So a lot of this will depend, because this is 2012 coming up, so a lot of what we're going to see in terms of an economic downturn, if it lags into the entire year, will really have an effect on the 2012 election.
Well, let's hope that things look bad for Obama at that time. We'll just have to wait and see what's going to unfold. Right now, it sounds as if almost the Obamacare is not going to be decided on by the Supreme Court until just during the elections. That's going to be a terrible time for Obama. You know, certainly if the Supreme Court declares it unconstitutional. So there are a lot of things that are going to happen between now and next year's election. I think this is going to be a very exciting time.
Well, I've heard that this case on the Obamacare will go into the current docket and should be decided by June of 2012. That'll put it well before the election.
Well, I hope in some ways I hope you're right. In other ways, I hope you're wrong. I would like to have the thing decided, and I'd certainly like to see it killed once and for all. But it's going to be interesting to see what happens.
It will.
Anyway, because our guest is Joel Skousen. We're talking about what is going to be happening financially, and certainly the dire financial straits that our nation finds itself in. We'll be back here in just a moment, right here at Genesis.
That starts here.
Well, Dr. Stan here at the Genesis Communication Network, our guest Joel Skousen, and certainly, Joel, before we go on, I wanted you to tell our listeners how they can subscribe to the World Affairs Brief and how they can get your books, A Secure Home. Certainly, go ahead.
Thank you, Stan. The World Affairs Brief is showcased on my website, worldaffairsbrief.com. And listeners will issue by emailing me at editor@worldaffairsbrief.com. Also on my other website, joelskousen.com, people can see a review of the books that I've written, especially about self-sufficiency, high-security residences, and strategic relocation. My largest book is called The Secure Home. It's about 700 pages, big as a telephone book, and has everything a person needs to know about high-security construction, remodeling, and planning for self-sufficiency, solar power generation, wind power, all of those things. My top seller, however, is the Strategic Relocation, the new third edition, which has all new color format, about three-quarter new text, and covers every state and province in North America. Just a wealth of information about contingency planning if you can't relocate, and how to make those relocation decisions. The last book I have is How to Implement a High-Security Shelter in the Home. It's a plan book on how to do a safe room in an existing basement. And all three of these books can be purchased from Radio Liberty.
By calling 1-800-544-8927. That's 1-800-544-8927, and they are among our best sellers. But go right ahead, Joel.
Well, let me finish up this section on the economy and the threat of collapse by quoting Doug Casey. He says, I see absolutely no way without a collapse of the U.S. currency and a total reordering of the U.S. economy. But once again, the question is, how big, how soon, how precipitous is the decline, whether it's now or later. All of those on the collapse side, the instantaneous or imminent collapse side of the debate, really don't understand, in my opinion, the powers of the conspiracy that controls our government and what they're intending to do. And that's why I think that they're going to put things on a downhill slide a lot longer than we think, because they have to reach the point when they can use war as the major thesis for moving people towards a new world order. Economic difficulties alone won't do that. But economic difficulties certainly will justify new controls, new solutions, which will be socialist solutions or stimulus. If they let the economy go down another notch and keep it there for the next couple of years, it means that they intend to elect a controlled Republican to complete the manipulation of conservatives. We're at the point in this nation where everything that Obama does will meet with conservative opposition, which is good. But if a false conservative leader gets in office and proposes similar things with a different name, most people will be fooled and jump on board, just like they did when George Bush, a supposed conservative, proposed things that no Democrat could have gotten away with. That's why the powers that be seem determined to suppress Ron Paul's candidacy and promote other controlled Republicans who, interestingly enough, are now promoting some of Paul's fiscal arguments against the Fed. Like Rick Perry is picking up on a lot of that. But my contention is they have no intention to follow through. Only Ron Paul can be trusted to act with courage and not compromise what he believes. Well, that leads me to the next topic, Stan, which is reshuffling the Republican candidates once again. The establishment once again is scrambling to set up new presidential contenders in the wake of Rick Perry's poor showing in the last two debates. Several articles in the mainstream conservative press panned Perry's Florida debate performance and handed the victory to Romney. One of those was the Wall Street Journal and the other was Fox News. That makes two victories in a row. But to keep these two victories over Perry from accruing to Mitt Romney's favor, the Washington Post came out with a hit piece about how the Florida debate meant none of the above. In other words, if our boy Perry, the fake conservative, can't win, we aren't going to let anybody like Romney win either. So as in prior debates, online voting always shows Ron Paul as the favorite. Well, strong conservatives vote far more in these kind of polls than the mainstream voters do. That's one of the reasons for that. But Paul really did win several debates prior to Florida. He knew, for example, that they were going to avoid him, so he grabs the microphone on several occasions and successfully alters the debate agenda. But that didn't happen in Florida. The moderators were prepared to make sure that time went to Perry and Romney, leaving Paul with less than 4.5 minutes out of the whole 2 hours. When they did throw a question to Paul, it was so banal and so predictable that it gave him little substance to respond to. So much as I like Ron Paul, there's no way he was allowed to speak, let alone win that debate. So the Hill.com, a major establishment commentary site on politics, was the first to point out that Perry might not make it. Brent Budowski of the Hill said, I wrote in August that Rick Perry will self-destruct within 30 days. His prospects for the presidency were as phony as the fantasy of a two-person race was false. Perry is a phony conservative who is not conservative. He's a pay-for-play politician who gobbled up Obama's stimulus like a hound dog eating a bone and created oceans of new government jobs in Texas while his big donors mysteriously received big government contracts. The Texas deficit ballooned and Texas jobless rate doubled under Rick Perry's watch. Well, a lot of that was pointed out in the debates as well. He goes on and says, I will not speculate about the reasons for Rick Perry's strange, weird, and incoherent debate performance. Major new negative stories about Perry will soon emerge in the media. Trust me. Perry will drop out long before the year ends. Now, my comment is, I'm not exactly certain about that. We must keep in mind that a Republican has to pass muster in the conservative Christian ranks. He has to win, therefore, in South Carolina and Florida, where both are largely controlled in the Republican primary by evangelical Republican voters. And there's no other candidate that panders to the evangelicals like Perry did. And I use the word pander because that's exactly what he's doing. I don't think he's any more Christian than George W. Bush was. But he certainly plays the evangelicals like a harp.
Just like George Bush did.
That's right. Now, if Perry dropped out today, says Budowski, Ron Paul would be well into second place. Will pundits say it's now a two-man race between Romney and Paul? No, they won't. Obviously, they won't give Paul any credit for being in second place. He says Sarah Palin could jump in, but if she did, her motive would be to prevent other Republicans from winning, and Obama would clean Palin's clock, meaning that she hasn't got a chance of winning, and I think that's true. So what's next, he says? When Perry drops out, Ron Paul could be in second place. It could be a magical moment for Ron Paul or even perhaps Herman Cain for a clean shot at second place. Let's see what they both do with it. Both Paul and Cain deserve far more respect from the major media, he says. This is not a Soviet campaign where Pravda-like pundits treat certain candidates as though they did not exist. Well, what planet does he live on, Dr. Stan? That's exactly what is happening.
I know that Florida debate where they just wouldn't allow Ron Paul to say anything was the most beautiful example. And when he wins these polls, they almost never get into the mainline media. We get them on the internet, but we never hear it from, CNN does a poll, and then, of course, when Ron Paul wins it, why they never announce it. Go right ahead.
Well, and look at New Hampshire. They ran a major poll up in New Hampshire, and guess what the headline was? Romney leads New Hampshire, Huntsman in third, Perry in fourth.
Right.
Well, guess who was second? It was Ron Paul, the ghost candidate that nobody mentioned. I mean, if that isn't proof that we got a Pravda-like, controlled media that won't give credit to where it really is deserved.
Well, I'm just hoping and praying the American people will begin to understand that the media is controlled, that our reality is controlled, and they're going to have to get involved. And I would suggest that they go to Alex Jones' website. He's got some wonderful, wonderful things there. And Sydney, you can hear actually what little Ron Paul gets to say. They'll usually take all of his remarks from the debate and have it posted there, which is really rather interesting to hear how he responds. And then you don't have to hear all the senseless rhetoric from all the other candidates. Well,
yeah, I'll look forward to that.
Okay, well, we're going to be back here in just a moment. Our guest, of course, is Joel Skousen. We're talking about what's going on today. And Sydney, we'll be back in just a moment here for the last segment of this afternoon's program with Joel Skousen. Well, Dr. Stan, back here for our last segment. Joel, go right ahead.
Well, we're talking about the various candidates and how the establishment is still searching for someone other than Romney who can win the nomination, someone that they can control. Budowski of thehill.com says if John Huntsman moves above the 10% level that he recently pulled in New Hampshire, he could become a very serious candidate. But if not, he drops out by December and endorses Mitt Romney. Well, that may be true, but Huntsman probably will do well in New Hampshire. He's got the money to stay in for the long haul, and he is being pushed by the establishment. I think it's more for future usefulness to the globalists than to win this time around. He's charismatic and he's dangerous. Besides, I don't think a liberal Mormon could win in the primaries against the high levels of evangelical prejudice that currently exist there. A really principled conservative Mormon might do well, but neither Huntsman or Romney are constitutional conservatives, far from it. Budowski then ends and says, forget Chris Christie. Well, that was written a little bit earlier in the week, and he had not seen the massive campaign that had just come out pushing Chris Christie. The establishment media was flooded this week with rumors that Christie is considering entering the race, and the most telling comment was by the New York Post, saying the renewed consideration about a White House run for Christie came after prodding this week from some Republicans he idolizes, including former First Lady Nancy Reagan, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, and former President George W. Bush. Well, that should reassure the Tea Party, right, Stan? Another candidate who views Henry Kissinger and George Bush as mentors.
I feel so much better knowing that those are the people who really want him to run. No, I think that obviously the establishment is frightened to death we might get an American, somebody who believed in America, the Constitution, and apple pie in there is running, and it's going to be fascinating. I think this is going to be the most interesting period we've seen in a long time, right to the Republican convention.
Well, yeah, as you said, the fact that these globalist Republicans are calling Christie means the government kingmakers are at work preparing for a possible replacement for Perry. They don't want to leave anything up to chance. Christie, to his credit, has done a good job on the fiscal policy of New Jersey. That was a state where no opposition had any other choice but to attack the bankrupt policies of socialist New Jersey. But there was a puff piece in the Wall Street Journal praising Christie's bipartisan moves in passing crucial legislation. Well, that was clearly propaganda. Christie is hated by the Democratic legislatures in that state. He had to use strong-arm tactics to get anything done, which I'm all in favor of. I'm not a believer in bipartisan compromise. Now, as for why the establishment is pushing him, I'm not sure yet if Christie's capable of fulfilling the establishment need to provide evangelical voters with another phony conservative like Bush or Perry. Do you know what his religious affiliations are, Stan?
No, I really don't.
Well, he isn't wearing it on his sleeve like Perry is. They may not be able to, in other words, get him to be viewed as an evangelical candidate. It is clear, however, that the media is pushing him in the same way that they were pushing Perry a couple of months ago. And obviously the only reason they're bringing Christie to the public mind is because Perry may falter. If he fails, and there are no clear evangelical candidates up for consideration, gravitate to the lesser of all evils, which may just look like Christie. It's a sad commentary that many Christian conservatives are acceptable to this, lesser of two evils argument. On a more personal note, I do have a problem with Christie being grossly overweight. I've learned by long experience never to trust strong, dominant men who are also obese. It seems that there is a moral weakness almost always that accompanies this particular combination of powerful men and a gross weakness. There's something deeply compromising and hypocritical about strong men with big egos and ample self-control who fail to apply it to themselves and their physical drives.
So another William Howard Taft, huh?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, there's another piece of disinformation. I hope we might have just a couple of minutes, but the CIA is coming out and leaked classified documents to a couple of researchers at the Nixon Library, and both Harvard graduates, who now claim that the CIA simply invented the Russian missile precedent during the Eisenhower administration. And unfortunately, Kurt Nimo of InfoWars got taken in by this. I usually have great respect for Nimo's normal work, but he bought this one hook, line, and sinker and talked about the entire Soviet threat was manufactured by the military-industrial complex. It's absolutely bogus. I think the CIA is trying to put out this kind of disinformation so that when it becomes very obvious that the Russians are really rearming and another threat again, everybody will say, oh, yeah, just like the other time when you tried to tell us they were a threat. So this is a very serious thing. The U.S. never had any inspections on the ground in the Soviet Union at the time, nor have they ever been allowed to inspect any of the Soviets' modern installations. So how could they possibly know anything for sure? In fact, they don't want to know. They're purposely putting on the blinders, claiming that the Russians are always in compliance with treaties, but they haven't inspected any of the lethal bunker systems like Yamato Mountain, where they have whole missile factories ongoing producing missiles.
Well, I saw that, and I really wondered what this was all about. Hey, Joe, we're out of time. Thank you so much, and we'll look forward to talking to you next week.
My pleasure, Stan.
Thank you so much. Well, this is Dr. Stan. This is the time when I need to remind our listeners that, first of all, we're going to be having an all-day conference. It's going to be on the 23rd of October, and we do hope you're going to be able to come. Looks like we're going to have a good crowd. We got great speakers coming, and certainly a good time will be had by everyone. We're going to open the doors at 7:30, start promptly at 8:30, going to go through to 5:30 or 6. We're serving lunch. You're going to have reservations, so give us a call. Bring your neighbors, bring your friends, bring your skeptics. 1-800-544-8927. 1-800-544-8927. Then, of course, we want to remind you that our Radio Liberty is primarily listener-supported, and if you're going to, if you're in a position to help us, we'd love to hear from you, and I want to thank very much those people who have given so generously in the past that have allowed us to maintain our network. In fact, we just taking on a new station. It's going to be in Las Vegas, Nevada. Of course, it's going to be at 3 o'clock in the morning, but at least, Las Vegas is a city that never sleeps, and hopefully some of the people there will be listening at that time, but we are bringing on stations as rapidly as we can, but of course we need your help to do this. It's vitally important that people hear the truth. I would just simply suggest, if you have a chance, go to the Alex Jones website, and there's one of the items there today, and it is actually having to do with, of course, how the United States helped the Soviet Union arm itself, how the United States helped the Soviet Union arm. And basically there you'll see my interview with Anthony Sutton. They're running it there, which is fine with me. It was an interview we did in 1980 with Dr. Sutton before he passed away, but go to the website and watch it. It's well worthwhile, because you can also see it on my website at radioliberty.com under other videos. Let's see, that would be under DVDs. We actually have a section there, and we have all my old interviews and things, and it's called The Best Enemies Money Could Buy, but certainly Alex Jones has it posted. It's well worthwhile watching. Professor Sutton really gave his life trying to get the truth out. He's passed away, but he got a lot of great information out, and I was just so pleased to see Alex is using that DVD. So you go there and watch it on Alex Jones' website about how the U.S. funded the Soviets, but then, of course, they funded the Nazis. They're funding certainly the terrorists today. It's all part of a standard program that's like deja vu all over again. That is, of course, if you haven't read my book, Brotherhood of Darkness, shame on you. You need to get that. You need to get my talks on the dark secret and the forbidden secret. If you want to know about weather modification and how they are modifying the weather, and we see the storms and the droughts and all of these things, even earthquakes, why you certainly need to get my 4-tape set on weather control. We have an excellent DVD by Bob Fletcher, Weather as a Weapon. We have certainly a book on weather warfare. We have a 4-tape set on chemtrails, a 4-tape set on HAARP, and a book on HAARP. And ladies and gentlemen, they are engineering the weather today. They know how to do it, and certainly they're doing this to the detriment of the American people. Our telephone number is 1-800-544-8927, 1-800-544-8927. Our webpage is radioliberty.com. That's radioliberty.com. We ask you to go there to pull down our information and encourage others to listen to our programs on a daily basis, to watch our DVDs, to read our newsletters, and then please pray for America. Pray for revival, but please pray for Radio Liberty. For our provision and protection, we'll be right back.